Hello, everyone. We're going to be looking at process costing today. So there are two big systems that companies will use to allocate costs to their products. And we've looked at one of them already, which is job order costing, where our product is unique and we're tracing our cost to a job. And the one we're going to look at today is process costing. There's also activity-based costing, but that's a topic for another day. All right, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to dive into this process costing. And if you have the lecture notes that I've provided, you might want to use those to follow along. All right. So what is the business problem and how are we looking to solve it? How can accounting help solve it? And so the business problem here is very similar to the business problem in job order costing. And the question that we're asking is, how do we apply cost to similar products that are, mass produced in a continuous fashion? So that similarity of how do we apply costs, but this time we're looking at they're mass produced in a continuous fashion. And this is going to be a little bit different, actually a lot different than our job order costing, because we cannot directly trace those costs like we did in job order costing. So we're looking at process costing. We're going to be looking at the weighted average method. What is the ultimate goal? So the ultimate goal of both our job costing and our process costing are pretty much the same. And that's going to be to provide unit cost information. What we do with this unit cost information is we use it for product pricing, cost control, inventory valuation, and financial statement preparation. Right? So both our process and our job costing, that is the ultimate goal, but how we do it, that is going to be different. So let's take a look at some of the differences and similarities between job costing and process costing. All right, so in job costing, that manufacturing environment that it's best suited for is when you have unique jobs, right? When your jobs can be distinguished. So for instance, if we're making fire trucks, we can usually directly trace to fire trucks. Or if we're making a very custom ordered instrument, we can directly trace to that instrument. If we're in the service industry and you're an attorney or you're a CPA, each particular client and the services that you provide for that client can be directly traced to those costs to that client. All right, so this is going to be when you have products with distinguishable characteristics. Right, but what about process costing? Okay, this is when you have similar products. All right, so if we're making potato chips, one bag of potato chips looks just like the next bag of potato chips. Same size, same quantity, same taste, same flavor. We're just going to keep on making those Lay's or those Doritos, Cooler Ranch, whatever your favorite is. And it's going to be a continuous process. Okay, when it's that continuous process over a period of time, the cost object that we're going to use for accumulating costs are going to vary a little bit. So when we're doing job costing, we're going to be costing our accumulating this cost to actually specific jobs, this instrument, this client. When we're doing process costing, we're going to be allocating those costs to a process or a department. Right, so if we have, let's think about making butter. Maybe we have the churning and the forming department, right? So the first process is it keeps turning, we churn and churn those ingredients in order to make our butter. And then that's one department in our process. Then we're going to move it to the next, which is the forming. We take that churn butter and we mold it into those cubes and then we wrap it. Right. So those would be two distinct departments and processes, and we would allocate the cost to that department. And the primary document for tracking costs, so for job costing, we use a job cost sheet. And for process costing, we use what's called a production cost report. And the manufacturing cost categories, now both of these costs are still similar, okay? So if we're using job costing or process costing, we still have our direct materials, our direct labor, and our manufacturing overhead. Those are still going to be the same. And so, but when we look at the categories, we're going to use direct materials, direct labor, and that manufacturing overhead. And we have 3 different areas for that on our job cost report. When we're using process costing, we're thinking about it a little bit differently. So we still have direct materials, right? The materials that we're going to add. So if we're going back to our butter example, we might be adding the cream and maybe a little bit of salt in that churning process, right? Those are our direct materials. But then our direct labor and our manufacturing overhead, those are going to be called, and this is a difference, conversion cost. Okay, so conversion costs are going to be your direct labor and your manufacturing overhead added together. So both job process costing and process costing still have direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead, but in process costing, we call the direct labor and manufacturing overhead conversion cost, and we add them together. Now let's think about the flow of these costs through the different accounts. So in a job order costing, the flow of the materials parallels the physical flow, those costs. Okay. So as we incur direct labor, it flows into that work in process account to that job. As we bring out materials, it goes straight into that job. So as we're continuously incurring these costs, we're able to allocate it directly to that physical flow. But when we're looking at the flow of costs through the accounts, we're going to be putting those in more on department, right? We're going to look at what the process is. So another way to think about it is it's like rolling that snowball into a snowman. So as we first start making our bag of potato chips, right, we're going to pick up the costs of the potatoes. Then we're going to pick up the cost of the frying oil. We're going to pick up the cost of the labor to cut those and it just keeps going with the product as it goes through each department, right? And at the very end, after we've continued rolling that snowman through the different departments, we have a finished product. So let's take a little look here. Okay, so this panel shows an example called Life Fitness Job Costing System. And notice that it has a single work in process inventory control account that's supported by individual job cost records for each job that's being worked on. So Life Fitness is going to assign direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead to individual jobs. So we see those job 100, 101, and 102. When it's finished, the costs are going to flow directly into that finished goods inventory. When the job is sold, that's when the cost flows out of the finished goods inventory into cost of goods sold. Okay, so as we're looking here, we see that it also on our T accounts, we see our raw materials inventory, our wages payable, our manufacturing overhead. You've also seen this as factory labor. Okay. And so these flow into work in process, then to finished goods, and then the cost of goods sold. All right, so we have one work in process inventory account, multiple job cost records within that work in process account, but only one work in process account. Now let's take a look at the flow of costs when we're using process costing. So in contrast to Life Fitness individual jobs, Jelly Belly, right, it makes jelly beans, use a series of 3 manufacturing processes to produce jelly beans. So if we think about how we make jelly beans, we've got the centers, right? I love jelly beans. You got those like little gooey centers, and then you have the shells, the harder shells, and then you put them in the packaging. So we've got 3 different processes and 3 different work in process accounts that this jelly beans are going to basically flow through. So we still have raw materials inventory, but now we have multiple work in process accounts, and we'll have one for each process. Then we have our finished goods inventory, and then it's going to move to cost of goods sold. Okay, so direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead are assigned to each processing department's work in process inventory count based on the manufacturing cost incurred by that process. All right, so it's not by job, but by the process. So we can see here that we have our work in process inventory centers, shells, and packaging. And each one of those is getting raw materials inventory, right? To each one of those work in process. Each one of those also incurs labor, right? And each one of those is allocated a portion of those manufacturing overhead. Okay. Then when it's done, it's going to move to our finished goods inventory. And then when it's sold, the cost of goods sold. All right, let's work through an example. So if you have the lecture handout, I recommend you get that ready so that you can work through this with me. So let's look at Land O'Lakes, and let's just say that making butter involves two processing departments. We're going to use churning and forming. All right, so we're going to churn that butter, we're going to form the butter, and end up with butter. Right? So let's start off. So during November, we have 1,400,000 of direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing costs incurred in the churning department. To keep our example simple, we're going to say that we have no beginning and no ending work in process. All the butter that we started churning on November 1st, on November 30th, we had completely finished and transferred it out, and we had no ending work in process inventory. We completely finished it. Now, this is a bit of an unrealistic example, but again, we're starting off pretty simple. So the question is, what is the cost per unit for churning the butter? Well, what is a unit here? We're going to say that a unit is pounds. And we see that we had 1,400,000 of cost, and we made 1 million pounds. So if we divide the cost by the total pounds, we see that it would have cost us $1.40 per unit, which is per pound. Okay. So it's simple when we only have one department and we have no beginning and no ending inventory. But that's not going to be what's the case. Land O'Lakes is going to continuously be making their butter. So they're going to continue to put their raw materials into the churning vats, and then they're going to move those raw materials out when it's finished, and it's going to keep starting over again. So if we're looking at November 30th at 11:59, when we're closing our books, we're still going to be churning butter. But we have to have a period endpoint at some point. Okay, so now let's look and assume that the same 1 million pounds of butter goes through the forming department at a total cost of 300,000. Because remember, we're saying there's two departments, our churning and our forming. So if it goes through at 300,000, and we still have that same million pounds, then we have 30 cents a unit for the forming. So what is the cost of doing a fully processing a pound of butter? Well, we know in the first department, it costs us $1.40. So it costs us $1.40 in the churning department. And we know that it costs us 30 cents in the forming department, which gives us a total of $1.70 of the cost for each pound of butter. Now it's asking if each pound sells at $2.50, what is our gross profit? Okay, so we're going to take our sales less our cost of goods sold. It's going to give us our gross profit, and that will be 80 cents per pound of butter. Okay. So remember, we had to actually go back to our churning department, and include how much of cost did that pound of butter incur in the churning department, then add how many costs would that pound of butter incurred in the forming department. We add those together, and that's the total cost that we would have incurred for our pound of butter. All right, so it's pretty simple though, as I was mentioning before, when we have at our accounting periods, 0 in beginning inventory and 0 in ending. But that's not reality. So the problem is going to arise when you have units left in that ending work in process. So let's look at that for a moment. So let's say that in addition to the 1 million pounds of butter that we transferred out of the churning department because it was done, we still have 200,000 pounds that we're still churning. So that would be our ending work in process. And of all of these 200,000 pounds, it's only 40% of the way through the process. So it's only 40% complete. So if, let's just say, for example, that a butter had to churn for 100 minutes, they've only churned for 40 minutes. They still have 60 minutes to go. If the butter has to churn for 100 hours, it's only churned for 40 hours, 60 more hours to go. Okay. So why couldn't we just assign the total 1.4 million of cost to the 1 million pounds of butter that we transferred out? Well, that would not accurately represent our cost, right? Because some of those costs at 1.4 million are to the 200,000 that we still have left. So if we allocated all of it, we would be overpricing the amount that's going out into our next department. Okay. So we can't put all of it there because some of that 1.4 million, okay, relates to, put some there, the 200,000 pounds left, right? So we don't want to assign that out. But we can't just say that the 1.4 million is evenly all over the 1.2, because if we do that, then we're going to assign more cost to the 200,000 and not enough cost to the 1 million that's being transferred out, right? So how do we solve this problem? Now, what we're doing is we're putting in artificial stop points, right? At November 30th, we're still going in and we're still churning butter, but we need to close our books. So because we need to close our books, we're basically saying stop. We need to figure out how many units that we've made for this month so we can assign the costs that have been to this month to the different units and come up with that unit price. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at equivalent units. We're going to think, all right, out of all of those pounds of butter that we still have churning, right? Those 300,000 pounds, or was it those 200,000 pounds that we still have churning there? Let's just do some math and let's say how many equivalent whole pounds is that? Because that's going to make our future math easier if we just do this equation now. And here's an example to think about, and that would be pizza. All right, so let's just say, just to think about it here, when you have a party, right, and you have a lot of pizza, when you at the end of the night and you're going to put this leftover pizza back into your refrigerator, are you going to put in each individual box into the refrigerator? Probably not. You may not have enough room for all those boxes. So you're going to open up the lids of all these boxes and you're going to see how much pizza you have left. And then you're probably going to look at it and you're going to start combining. Right? You're going to combine these so that maybe instead of putting in 3 boxes, you only have to put 1 box in. And that's the same thought process behind equivalent units. So let's say we've got some friends over. Oops. And you order the following pizzas: 1 pepperoni, 1 pineapple and olive. Don't knock it until you try it. It is that perfect blend of sweet and salty. It is really good. It happens to be my favorite. I know, just try it sometime. All right, so you've got 1 pepperoni, 1 pineapple and olive, 1 cheese, and 1 anchovy. So you and your friends have ordered 4 boxes of pizza. At the end of the night, it's now time for you to put these boxes of pizza back into your fridge. You're not going to put 4 boxes in. It's not going to fit, right? So you have 1/3 of the pepperoni left, 1/3 of the pineapple and olive left, and 1/3 of the cheese pizza left. And because somebody thought they'd be funny and order an anchovy pizza, you have an entire anchovy pizza because who really wanted to eat that, right? Now, not that I can talk, I mean pineapple and olive over here, but still. So we would put not 4 boxes in, but most of us would take these 3 boxes and we would take that 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and we would combine it into 1 box. So we would think at the end of the night, instead of having 1/3 of this, 1/3 of that, 1/3 of this, and 1 anchovy, we would have 2 whole pizzas. We would have the equivalent of 2 whole pizzas. Okay. But we have 4 partial pizzas, or I guess you could say 3, since we have 3 partial and 1 whole. Now, in reality, we'd probably just throw out the anchovy and just have one partial pizza at the end of the night. But in this example, we still have two. Okay, so that's the same thing we're going to do in that thought process of equivalent units. We're going to look to see how many partial things we have and combine them into wholes to make our math easier. So instead of walking around and being like on computers, well, this one's partially assembled, so let me figure out how much that costs. And this is not a partially assembled, this is partially assembled. Instead of saying, oh my goodness, I've got these 8 partially assembled computers, we would look at that and we say, okay, that's the equivalent of 2 fully assembled computers, just to help make our math easy as we're looking at closing out an accounting period. All right, got a little ahead of my slides here. So again, if we gathered all the leftover pizzas left over, it would be the equivalent of having 2 whole pizzas. Okay, so what is the formula? How did we arrive at that? So what is the formula for determining equivalent units? All right, so our formula for an equivalent unit, okay. All right, and this would be of ending work in process, right? All right, it would be the number of partially complete units times the percentage of completion. Okay, so in this case, if we're going to use it for pizza, we had 3 partially complete pizzas. And there were a third complete, right? There were a third there, which would give us the equivalent unit of 1 whole pizza. All right, so what do we use these equivalent units for? All right, so we use these to measure the work done during a period. Okay. And we're able to express that in fully completed units. Okay, now in process costing, we are going to have 2 different equivalent units. We're going to calculate equivalent units separately for direct materials and conversion cost. All right, so remember we've got direct materials here, and then we have conversion costs, and the conversion costs are going to be our direct labor plus our manufacturing overhead. And the reason we're going to do them separately is they each have their own percentage of completion. And let's think about that for a moment. So if we have, back to our butter example, if we think about the churning process, at the very beginning, before we do any churning, we're going to put in the cream and the salt. Then we're going to start churning. We're not going to add any more cream or salt during that churning process. We have added in all of the direct materials. Now, while it's still churning, we're going to have direct labor as we go check on it, make sure it's right, it's going okay. We're going to have manufacturing overhead as we're using electricity, and we have the factory that it's churning in, and the other cleaning crew that's still making sure things are clean, the repairs. So that's going to continue on, but there will be no more direct materials being added to that process. So as soon as something enters into the churning department for the butter, and we add that cream and we add that salt, the direct materials are 100% complete in that example. But our direct labor and manufacturing overhead, well, that could be 40% complete, or maybe it's 60% complete. It all depends on how long it's been churning, how much longer it needs to churn. But regardless of how much time is left in the churning department, there'll still be no more direct materials put in. And that's why we're going to have 2 different percentages of completion. Let's thinking about the forming part. Let's say that our butter is now complete in churning. We're going to take that butter and we're going to move it to forming. They're going to now be doing direct materials and manufacturing overhead, direct labor and manufacturing overhead as they form the butter. but there's no materials that's added until the very end of the process when they put a wrapper on it. So that wax paper wrapper is at the very end, the very last step. So there would be, if it was still in process in the forming department, direct materials is probably not 100% complete. It's probably, maybe it's 0, right? Because it's not done yet. We haven't added that wrapper yet until right before the end. All right, so just something to keep in mind is that you're going to have 2 different equivalent units for direct materials and direct labor and manufacturing overhead, your conversion cost. Okay. All right, so there are 5 steps to process costing. So we have a production cost report where all steps are on one schedule. Okay, we're going to be looking at that. And that is what we're going to be going over in the next video.